Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 66 of Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast where, with my good friend and colleague Matt Kelly, we take a deep dive into a compliance or compliance-related topic, literally going into the weeds to fully geek out around the subject. Today, we're going to take a look at the misconduct penalty or the stigma effect that every executive has going forward in terms of salary if they have worked at a company which has had a financial restatement or other nefarious act happen on their watch. This is not people who have actually participated in a fraud or other misconduct which could lead to a financial misstatement, but just people who have worked at those companies. It's based upon a blog post that Matt had on January 15th entitled The Salary Penalty for Misconduct, which is based upon a paper by George Serafeim and Boris Groysberg from the Harvard Business School, where they took a look at a wide range of job placements and pay data since 2004, and they found a stigma of listing a discredited company on your resume, even if it had nothing to do with the misconduct, if you had nothing to do with the misconduct. It's a really interesting topic, and it's something that chief compliance officers and compliance practitioners need to be able to raise to senior management as yet another reason that they should have a robust ethical culture and compliance program in place. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again with my good friend and colleague Matt Kelly for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds, the compliance podcast that takes a deep dive each week into a compliance or compliance-related topic, literally going into the weeds. Today we have a really interesting, weedy, nerdy, geeky, yet extremely interesting and important topic, which is the salary penalty for misconduct. It's based upon a blog post that Matt wrote earlier in this week that's really started with a fascinating paper. So, Matt, why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, this was just great, Tom. This is a paper written by two Harvard Business School professors that I came across not long ago. They are Boris Groysberg and George Serafeim, and they looked at how working at a company that has, as they said, had been shamed by having a financial restatement, having a company like that in your past resume or your work history somewhere, how does that affect the salary that you can get at your next job? And they found that, broadly speaking, you can lose anywhere from 4 to 10% of the salary at your next job when the recruiters there are looking to see, and they say, oh, yeah, he worked here, she worked there, they had a restatement, they've had trouble. So therefore, they are tainted because they worked at the tainted company, so we wind up giving them a lower salary. That's basically what the paper found, and I wouldn't even say that is a particularly nerdy or niche kind of a topic. I mean, that's really relevant for compliance officers or any other senior executive. If you work at a company that experiences misconduct, you're going to wind up paying for that as you go on through your career with your next job, because people will be more likely to pay you less.
So, Matt, when I first read your paper, I was concerned that this would be, that they were focusing on chief compliance officers and how even people in the compliance function. But that's not the focus of their paper. It's on senior execs and management. So could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So their finding applies to anyone. Any executive. I suspect that some similar salary penalty exists for lower employees, but I'll walk you through the study, and here's what they did. They teamed up with a big global recruitment firm, and they looked at slightly more than 2,000 job placements at the executive level from 2004 to 2011. And out of the 2,000 placements that they examined, they found that roughly 18% of the people had a company in their past that had experienced a financial restatement. They defined misconduct or tainted company as a restatement. But then through a very long, elaborate formula that they concocted, which is on their paper, if you took college level calculus and you're brave, you could read the formula. You could probably plug in your own variables. But they came up with a formula accounting for number of years in the past of this restatement, your position, your current salary, the salary you get at the placement that they were examining, and all these other factors. And they found a few big conclusions. So overall, somebody with a restatement in their past was more likely to get a 4.6% salary reduction in their next offer. Like they would be offered 4.6% less in the placement they got compared to a comparable executive who did not have a tainted company in his or her work's history. And that was for anyone. That's for the VP of sales, the head of intellectual property, the chief compliance officer, the VP of financial planning and analysis, the chief operating officer, anybody at all, any title, the whole 9 yards. They did not restrict who they looked at. 4.6% less. If you had a restatement in your recent past, you would probably suffer about a 5.6% salary penalty. And they defined recent as 9 years. So everybody listening, think about how many jobs and how many career shifts have you made over the last 9 years. And this could still affect you to that greater degree. And then any executives out there who are listening, specifically working in the finance function, you are most likely to get up to a 9.9% reduction or a penalty in your future salary, which does make sense because they were looking at financial misconduct in a restatement. That was their definition. They did not look at things like an FCPA violation, anti-money laundering violations, or sexual harassment trouble or anything like that. But I think we could safely assume that this misconduct penalty as defined by financial restatements, I mean, does anybody really think that doesn't also hold true for other types of misconduct? If you are working at Uber with its harassment trouble, or Wells Fargo with its false accounting scandals and whatnot, the mere existence of having a tainted company on your resume somewhere can lead to a penalty you're going to suffer when you go out in the job market. And by the way, Tom, I should point out that now here's the bad news, is that these numbers they found are probably even worse in real life because they only looked at job placements that actually happened. So think of all the job placements that people might have been trying for that they never got at all because the recruiter said, oh, well, you worked at Enron in 2001, out. You worked at Uber in 2016, out. You worked at Wells Fargo, out. The numbers they came up with are for people who overcame that, I guess we'll call it that stigma risk anyways, and they still suffered this penalty. There's a whole other realm of candidates who never even got that far, so probably your career prospects are that much more worse. We'll never know exactly how much worse, but these numbers they already found, they ain't good to begin with.
So I was intrigued also, Matt, with the reasons for this discount, lower salary, cost going forward. And the point you raised in your blog post was that people in this situation may be not exactly desperate, but they may be willing to consider a lower salary, and employers and recruiters will exploit that. But I wanted to maybe take it either a step further in a little bit different direction, because my experience with this type of catastrophic corporate failure in Houston, of course, is around Enron. And I saw people have to take much lower paying jobs after Enron imploded, and whether they were tainted or not, to your point, they simply worked there. And many people that I knew in the Enron legal department had to go out and get other jobs. Now, part of that was because Enron paid top dollar, but nevertheless, they were in a position where they weren't just tainted and they weren't just looking. They had to get something else and had to get something different.
That's very true. The business professors, they, of course, being professors, they put an economic analysis spin on this first, that basically saying, What explains that gap is, well, the recruiters must do a little bit more extra work and have to argue your case a little bit more to the hiring managers that, oh, yeah, they worked at the tainted company, but we should hire them anyways because of X, Y, and Z. And so maybe that is the cost of that extra labor manifests in the salary gap. Now, that's what economics and business professors like to say. I think, very much like you said, here in the real world, if you're at a company that has terrible reputation and suddenly implodes, you're hard up for work, you're willing to take a lower job. And people are going to know that, and they're going to exploit it. What I also thought was interesting was really the point that this phenomena exists even if you never had anything to do with the misconduct at all. They had a wonderful quote there. They say, though not guilty of financial misrepresentation, alumni may be considered guilty of participating in an enabling culture. So that might explain, you work at company X from 2010 to 2014, but then they have a big blowout in 2016 and you were not involved in it. You were already gone before it ever happened, maybe. But here in 2018, you're trying to get a job. You got company X on your resume, even though you had nothing to do with this. Then suddenly, boom, you're suffering the salary penalty, the misconduct penalty. I think that's a very persuasive argument for compliance officers when you have these town halls trying to tell people, why does this matter? Because if this stuff happens and you are anywhere near it, it's like a thermonuclear blast. You don't have to be at ground zero to get seriously contaminated. You can be far away from it, and you can be far away from it in time and in responsibility. You're still going to see this happen to you. And I think that's a very persuasive way to get people's attention that, yes, this matters, because we as a society, we penalize people, rightly or wrongly. We penalize them if we think you must be near that tainted, shady business for some reason.
So let me, wow, no wonder they call economics the dismal science.
Yeah.
But let me take this a little bit different direction, because it's something I've been thinking about in terms of hiring from companies that have had a catastrophic failure, whether it be Wells Fargo, Uber, FCPA, or Enron or other. And it's really the following. If an employee is at one of those companies, are they so tainted that they now wear a red flag firmly pasted on their forehead or their chest that cannot be overcome? And I would like to contrast that with someone along the lines of Thomas Watson Sr., who said, I want to hire the guy that's failed because he's going to learn from his lessons and apply those lessons going forward. And I'm just wondering if is that such a dichotomy now, or do people basically get one chance now and that's it?
I probably would split those out. There's a distinction between you failed because you broke the law and you committed misconduct, and you failed because, you didn't build the flying car on the first try. Okay, the Ford Advanced R&D department is still going to hire you to see maybe you can build it on the second try. If you fail because you couldn't make your sales numbers, so you bribed your way to the top and then you got busted on an FCPA violation, that's different. And I could see the next hiring guy saying, I'm sorry, but I just don't think that that's going to work. While I agree that Thomas Watson had a very sort of forward thinking and I think intelligent response to how you should hire people who learn from failure. I mean, there's different types of failure and there's different types of people. Some of us are very cynical out there. We have got no idea how the modern recruiting system works through, automating keywords that maybe they just want to say no engineers who worked at Uber in the last 2 years because they're all, they're just rampant allegations of harassment. Let's save ourselves that trouble. There are other engineers that were just as good working at other places where we don't have to worry about that. I don't know if it's, like I said, if it's right or wrong, but the fact is it's there. It correlates. And it feels right to me. I can remember once, long ago, I interviewed Sam Antar. So for those of you who don't know Sam, He is a well-known anti-corruption activist. He's a business professor these days who was a corrupt CFO at a stereo company up in the Northeast back in the 80s. It was involved in a gigantic fraud that he wound up testifying against his brother, who then went to prison. But Sam Antar, and I talked to Sam in 2007, and this misconduct happened in 1980, whenever. Sam was saying it was a terrible thing he did because he would get calls from recruiters in like 2001. Oh, I see so-and-so worked at Crazy Eddie's back in the 80s. Were they involved in the misconduct? He's like, no, the number of people that did this were small. Right. This was forever ago. Everybody now has like 15 years of work experience since then. And still recruiters would say, oh, but you worked way back there back in the day, so you must have a cloud over you. And he said that was a very powerful sense that really made him learn the error of his ways. And this is just a formulaic quantification of that same phenomena that he was saying. Is, like, yes, this can haunt people, innocent people, for a long, long time. So we all have to be involved in getting good conduct because we're all going to get bit on the rear end if we don't.
So you touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to maybe explore how the compliance practitioner, the compliance professional, the chief compliance officer can really use this information going forward. And let me contrast it with a different approach, which I've heard Dan Chapman talk about. And he talks about, when speaking to senior executives, if you have to give up 5, 10, or 20% of your time to deal with a corruption investigation or other major internal investigation, what would that mean for your personal productivity, and what would that mean for the profitability of the company? This obviously is a little bit different because you're speaking to people on their personal career paths going forward, but it seems to me we're developing a body of more than anecdotal stories or anecdotes. We're developing a body of evidence which suggests really long-term stigmata and loss of profitability effects by not having a compliance program in place.
What I did was I think compliance officers could take this and put a very personal spin on it at these town halls or board meetings, or you're meeting with the business unit leaders about what does this mean for you. I took a hypothetical. Let's say that you and I are both up for a VP job of any sort, business development or procurement or compliance or legal or whatever. But we're up for a VP job that pays $175,000 a year. That's probably the going rate around the Northeast. I know one company where that's what they were offering lately. But because I worked at the corrupt company 5 or 10 years ago, I'm going to wind up suffering a 5.6% penalty. So, Tom, you get the job, you get $175,000. I get the next VP job. I only make $165,200. That's the difference. But that's in the first year. So now you and I are there for another 12 years, and we get 3% pay raises every year. But because I started at that lower base, I'm going to make less money year after year after year. At the end of the 12 years, I have earned cumulatively $143,000 less than you. Put that to your VP of procurement who's complaining, why do we need to upend all of our processes? Well, do you want to lose $143,000 over the next 12 years? Because maybe you could, because that's the math. And that's what we have seen here. They quantified the salary penalty. I'm just playing it out over time. Over the course of your career, you could lose hundreds of thousands of dollars, potentially for something that you had nothing to do with at all. And therefore, why would you not want to be heavily invested in keeping the misconduct out of your company? And in fact, there's even one great little anecdote I'll share. I posted this article on LinkedIn, and Scott Moritz, who is one of the other notable compliance thinkers out there, I think he works at, where does Scott work these days? Yes. So Scott was pointing out that he knew of instances where people came into a company after the restatement, after the mess. They were there to clean it up.
Right.
And when they were looking to move on, recruiters would say, well, you're at the mess company. Were you involved in that? And you have to argue your way out. No, I wasn't involved. I showed up after. I was there to clean it up. You should be giving me more money because I'm good at the cleaning. But human nature being what it is, you lose sight of that. You remember the keywords. You remember Enron. You remember WorldCom. You remember mess. You remember, oh, so therefore they must be tainted. It doesn't matter how true that is or not true or how fair it is. People struggle with it. And then they wind up in these positions, even though they should not at all, and it's not fair. But there you are.
So let me take this, unpack that two completely different directions, Matt. The first
Sure.
of all, as a recovering trial lawyer, I wanted the worst cases. I wanted in my world, catastrophic property damage cases or the huge contract cases, because those were the bigger challenges. Now, lawyers are not people; they're not civilians. I understand that. But the flip side of that is now take the perspective of the potential employer. I've worked at Crazy Eddie, then I went to work at Enron, then I went to the next one, and if you're an employer and you see that on a resume, what is your liability if you don't even ask the question, though? Because certainly I would say there's a potential red flag there, and it must be cleared. What if it turns out that I was one of the or the example I would give you is I once was consulting with a company that wanted to hire one of the convicted felons from Wilbros, the jail time convicted felon. And we argued, the compliance function argued as strenuously as we could that could not be done because that was put the company on clear actual knowledge that they had someone who engaged in prior conduct which violated the FCPA. And if they did so at their new employer, the new employer would be doubly liable. So to have to ask that question, I think that's almost a requirement for our potential employer now.
That's an excellent point. I hadn't stopped to consider at first, but I mean, you're right. Certainly if somebody wanted to hire a disbarred accountant to be your next VP of finance, you're going to put that person through extra due diligence. That does get to the microeconomic argument that these business professors floated, like where does the penalty come from? Maybe it comes from the extra due diligence you need to do and the extra arguing you need to do to say, okay, we're still going to hire this person. That exists on a case-by-case basis. And then when you sort of scale it up to the whole company, it winds up being a shorthand of, well, these people worked at these sketchy companies. I don't know, maybe they were sketchy, maybe they're not, but I got a dozen other resumes here. I might as well go with them instead. Or, to your point there, maybe they're going to have to put in extra due diligence. That's going to come out of something somewhere. Recruiters get paid based on the size of the salary. So the more work they do, the more fees they're going to have. And therefore, the company's going to be looking to try and get that cost back somehow. I could see where you're saying, that could be part of the big explanation of where these penalties come from.
So, Matt, I found this a really fascinating article, and the discussion was even much richer than I would have thought going forward. But it's a fascinating point. The thing I would like to end with is I saw representatives from the Department of Justice in 2017, specifically Ken Blanco and Rod Rosenstein, talk quite a bit about in the FCPA world the economic damage that corruption brings to individual economies or countries, their economies, and corporations shareholders. And this type of discussion and this type of academic rigor or academic analysis based upon the rigor of these two, I think is really leading the discussion of the perils of corruption and the responses to corruption in, I think, positive ways. And I really want to ask you about that in terms of the scope of your professional career as a business journalist. Have you seen a change in the discussion around corruption, or at least the kind of theoretical basis for the prosecution of corruption?
I mean, in certain ways, yes, I think I have. I think there's a big consensus among large companies, certainly, that like corruption does them no favors. And I might liken it more to what the citizens of corrupt countries go through. When I see people over here say, well, of course you have to bribe in India. That's just part of the culture. And I've talked to Indian nationals, and it makes their blood boil because they're like, no, we do not like bribing people. We get hit up for bribes in Delhi and Mumbai and everywhere else all the time, and we hate it. Corruption creates friction in the business process that gums up what a price of a good really should be. It gums up the profit you really should get. It gums up your ability to earn a living. It distorts everything. And so the anti-corruption that gets that out of the system is a good thing. And I think people are, in various ways, starting to realize that the costs of the anti-corruption effort are a far, far smaller cost than the damage that the corruption would have happen. I mean, how much time did you waste with your anti-corruption training this year? I don't know. You could probably figure it out, but is it going to equal the $143,000 I extrapolated for 12 years of money lost over the course of my career? That kind of stuff, those equations, those examples can really resonate with people. So I would love it if people took this chart I did up on my blog, take it, drop it into your next PowerPoint and shoot it all over the place at your organization, because that is a good gripping detail.
Well, Matt, this has been a fascinating discussion. I've been visiting with Matt Kelly on his blog post of January 15 entitled The Salary Penalty for Misconduct. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Matt at mkelly@radicalcompliance.com. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out about the only weekly compliance podcast that takes a deep dive, literally going into the weeds of a compliance or compliance-related topic. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode of Compliance Into the Weeds, and I hope you'll join us again next week when Matt Kelly and I take another deep dive into a compliance-related topic. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.